Approximately how many British soldiers were there?
4,500 battle-hardened Wellington's Invincibles is what they were called. These are the guys that had beaten Napoleon. Plus some Navy guys, some Marines, some colonial Marines, which were escaped slaves that were trained to be British Marines. You can go straight up.
Oh, you mean,
They were taken and they escaped from Virginia mostly, but I guess the Maryland countryside too.
these were the fighting the British, you mean? Or no. They were part, oh, they had been conscripted by the British. Hello.
Well, they were collected by the British, taken to Tangier Island, trained, given uniforms and guns, and about 200 of them were part of the attack on Washington, I believe.
So this is pretty low tide, if you will.
Yeah, and this is all silted up. This was, I wouldn't say a deep water harbor, but this was a working harbor with real sloops and various sailing ships, brigs would come right up and load tobacco and whatever other products. There were a lot of industrial products, I imagine, that were loaded and unloaded here. And they were taken, I guess, out to the bay and could go straight out to the ocean from there. This was I don't know what the word is, a working port, certainly a commercial port. And this is all silted up, including where we're standing. Apparently, it went all the way back to where that building is.
The Anacostia, so it was pretty high.
Yeah, or the eastern branch is what they called it.
The Americans were called?
Americans.
As far as the military...
Well, there's several distinctions. There's volunteers, which is a group of guys that get together and decide they're going to be a company of soldiers or sailors. Then there's militia, which were local people that were expected to show up on notice, and they were trained and were expected in many cases to bring their own weapons. That these were the Minutemen, essentially. It was an extended idea of what you may think of as the Minutemen, who would show up to defend their homeland, you know, the local whatever, and they would elect their own officers. And then there were regular army people, and Congress then, as now, was loath to fund a standing army. So there were very few regulars available, and most of the regulars that we did have were up on the Canadian border, because that's where the Americans were trying to wage the war. Essentially, the British felt that if they attacked the Chesapeake, that would keep American attention away from Canada, which they wanted to protect, and the Americans felt if they attacked Canada, that would, you know, induce the British to give up and leave the Chesapeake alone and stop impressing sailors and inciting Indians and all the other things that they were doing that started the war.
In 1812.
In 1812, right. Or they'd actually been doing it for 20 years before that, but finally by 1812, enough people had enough that war was declared.
So,
we almost went to war with them a few times. The biggest confrontation was 1807 under President Jefferson. It was before Madison was in office. There had been some British depredations, and they had actually attacked and impressed some sailors off of an American battleship, an actual American ship, naval ship, and that got the entire country so angry they almost went to war 5 years earlier, which is often forgotten.
So the objective, they took Washington. They captured Washington.
They did, but there was nobody there to require surrender of. The entire government had cleared out, And so they burned some public buildings and then suffered some casualties. There had been a freak storm, and General Ross, the British general, actually felt that he had done what he needed to do or wanted to do, and wanted to get out there as soon as possible, because he always felt that the Americans might be, regrouping and getting ready to counterattack.
How long were they in Washington?
I think 2 to 3 days.
Where'd they go after that?
They skedaddled. They came right back through here and went right back to their boats and got out. I guess, in their minds, they were 20-some miles inland in a large country with angry people. And they wanted to get out as soon as possible and try to preserve their victory without anything going wrong after that.
When was the battle at Fort McHenry?
About 2 weeks later. And that was, there's quite a story there. Ross had actually insisted that no, he didn't want to go to Baltimore, and when he sent his right-hand man off to England to deliver the news about the capture of Washington, he told him, you can tell them we're not going to Baltimore, we're going to leave it alone. But he was convinced later, mostly by the naval contingent, that Baltimore was a plum that needed picking, and the attack was about 2 weeks later. They showed up pretty much in Baltimore Harbor the evening of September 11th, but September 10th, but in force on September 11th, 1814.
And now Francis Scott Key was here at Bladensburg?
He was at Bladensburg fighting with the DC militia. He is credited with causing part of the confusion out there, whether rightly or wrongly. What you had was a bunch of mid-level officers that everybody was trying to do what they thought was right, because they thought there was a command vacuum, so they would take a company of men and say, you go over here, and then 5 minutes later they'd say, you go over here, and you go over here. And unfortunately James Monroe was a part of that too, and they were all trying very hard to make a defense that would stand, and essentially the men fell apart, under that, because there was that confused leadership.
So Francis Scott Key was just a militiaman. He wasn't any.
He was an officer working for, I think, a general. His name escapes me now, of the DC militia. But the way he got involved in Fort McHenry was there was, in Upper Marlboro, there was a gentleman who had afforded quarters to the British Army and been cordial to them, not in a traitorous way to the United States, but just said, okay, you're here, do what you need to do and go on. And then as soon as they left, this Dr. William Beans in Upper Marlboro was part of a party that was picking up British stragglers and imprisoning them. And word got back to the commander of the British forces that this guy who had so graciously put him up is now putting officers in jail. He was offended, and the British were offended, and they arrested him and took him aboard the flagship ultimately. And it's very possible that he would have been hung as a traitor.
Dr. Beans?
Dr. Beans. He was originally a Scotsman who had come 10 or 20 years earlier to the United States. So they could easily have said, you're still a British subject, and you did this, and you took British soldiers and imprisoned them, so we're going to hang you. That could have happened. So ultimately, Francis Scott Key, who was a connected lawyer, was approached to negotiate his release of Dr. Beans, along with Mr. Skinner, who was the I guess a chief parole officer for the United States, negotiator. So Skinner and Francis Scott Key went aboard, ultimately got aboard the flagship sitting off of Baltimore, and secured Beans's release and took him aboard their truce ship. And that is where 7 or 8 miles off of Fort McHenry, they stood and witnessed the bombing of Fort McHenry. And as a matter of fact, there is, I don't know if it's legend or whatever, that Dr. Beans in his 60s didn't have his glasses because he'd been taken in the night from his bed. And he was sitting there going, "Oh, say, can you see?" So that is the origin or the legend of that story.
So Dr. Beans was with Francis Scott Key?
Yes.
I didn't realize Francis Scott Key was a lawyer.
He was a lawyer and had been sent to negotiate the release of that prisoner.
Interesting. And they so you secured Dr. Beans' release. They were on their ship and they were leaving the harbor?
Well, they were on a truce ship. Skinner, who was the chief negotiator, and
a truce ship, you said?
He was truce.
That's called a truce ship.
Yeah.
Okay.
They had a white flag, and
I
they're going,
see.
"Don't kill us. We're coming to you."
I see.
And they came aboard the flagship, and they were invited to dinner, and everybody and the commanding admirals were very gracious, and they ate dinner with Skinner and Key ate dinner with the admirals and general, and they secured Beans's release basically by having brought letters from all of the British soldiers that Beans had treated and treated well, and they brought letters saying, "This guy's good, please let him go." And Key was the one that got those letters, and handed them to General Ross, and Ross said, "Okay, go ahead and take him, and you can take him and I'll release him." So they put him back on their truce ship and said, "But you're not going anywhere. We had you to dinner. You've heard all our plans. You know what we're going to do. So you're not going back until after this is done, after we attack Baltimore or do our demonstration or whatever it is."
Oh, the British.
The British said,
I see. You said
you can get back on your ship, but you're not leaving. You're going to sit right there.
You mean the whole ship?
Right.
Key and Beans and whoever was on the ship.
That's right.
The ship wasn't going to. The ship had to be with the British flagship.
That's
was
correct.
It must have been multiple ships that they were attacking.
There were probably 70 British ships.
70.
Out there in the outer harbor at Baltimore.
70 British ships attacking Baltimore.
There were battleships, huge, what's called 74s, which are enormous, that would take up the entire horizon here. There were 3 or 4 of those, and there were a bunch of probably 10 frigates, and then smaller ships, like the Constellation you see in Baltimore Harbor. That would be a small, kind of a mid-sized British frigate. The Americans had bigger. The Constellation is one of the smaller ones. I think the Constitution's probably bigger than the Constellation.
Oh.
But
this is neat.
Yeah,
this is really interesting. I mean, I find this really fascinating, and it's quite a different and unique perspective seeing it firsthand and hearing you explain it. It really makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
It comes off the history book pages.
So it's actually fascinating, and I hope...
well, this is the beginning.
Yeah. Forest. There was forest everywhere.